Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. In this installment, the commander we're discussing, I've really only got one thing that I want to say to her. You are tearing me apart, Liesa! Liesa, Shroud of Dusk completes the cycle of Innistrad Angel Sisters. A 5-mana 5/5 with flying and lifelink, Liesa exchanges her command tax mana payments for command tax life payments. This couples deviously with her triggered ability, which makes everyone lose 2 life for every spell they cast. Liesa's page is swimming with tons of life manipulation, especially a lot of life gain cards that we've seen in Black-White life gain before, but there's an extra layer of cruelty happening here too. Liesa doesn't just gain her own life, but adds on quite a lot of extra punishment against complacent enemies as well. Let's get right to it by taking Liesa's average deck list from the average deck feature and importing it to the Architect deck building website. Remember that, as always, the swaps we make must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or lower the overall cost of the deck. Okay, so this is definitely among the spendier deck lists that we've seen in this series. Life Gain is a big archetype to play around in, with lots of crazy cards and a lot of high prices. That's not the only thing that's tricky though. Liesa has also become an option for players who are interested in a Black-White Angel tribal deck, and we see small echoes of that amongst this average deck. It's only traces though. Liesa doesn't specify Angel tribal synergy, so the life manipulation does seem to be weighing out. That, plus the cost, is something we're going to have to consider a lot as we make upgrades. Therefore, I think the best way for us to tackle this list is to try something a little different than usual. We'll go in 3 distinct parts. First, we'll do some shared baseline upgrades. I'm going to use this section to discuss the cost-neutral improvements that I think this deck could benefit from as it currently stands. Then, in part 2, I'm going to take a moment to discuss upgrades for those who are looking to splurge and take the deck a bit farther. Importantly, we won't officially add or subtract any cards in this section, because the cards discussed in part 2 would break the budget restriction. Normally, I would just save this kind of future upgrades thing as an honorable mention, but as we'll soon see, this list is a little bit complicated, so this really requires a full section unto itself to discuss properly. Finally, in section 3, we're going to make this list more budget-friendly. This deck's current cost is higher than the typical starting point for a bunch of players out there, so I want to take some time to discuss ways to make it more accessible and bring it more in line with the traditional average deck cost that we're more used to encountering. To make this happen, this also means that we're going to make some pretty spicy gear shifts to the deck too. This means that there will be 2 deck lists in the description for you, one for the cost-neutral swaps that we make in part 1, and one for the budget-friendly options in part 3. So with this roadmap in place, let's start off with part 1. These are the swaps I think should be made to the current list for improvements, regardless of whether your deck matches this deck's current price point, or if you're on more of a cost restriction, or if you're a high roller Liesa player. These changes are slight, but they're important for Liesa players of all stripes. First things first, the number of lands makes me faint. This is too low. I know Liesa doesn't care about mana for commander tax, but the mana curve in this deck is not low, not at all. Black and white decks often have tons of powerhouse cards starting at the 4 mana spot, and they need consistent land drops to make any of those plays actually happen. We have to make room for more lands, which means we have to make more cuts than usual to make room for them. Right off the bat, my eye is drawn to a couple cards that I don't think will perform well for the way this deck is currently arranged. First is Sorin, Vengeful Bloodlord. As lifelink enablers go, this one is low caliber and impermanent. Liesa already has lifelink, but if we wanted to grant more lifelink to other creatures, there are better options than this guy. Next, we have Indulging Patrician. There's nothing inherently wrong with this card on its face, but as we get more acquainted with this deck, we'll soon see that it is among the least impressive life gain rewards that we could be playing, especially since it's restricted to only triggering on our end step. Lastly, and this is an awkward one, we'll need to cut the Starnheim Aspirant. This is one of the things that we sometimes see when a commander has multiple different build paths. This card is a bomb in Liesa Angel tribal decks. This current list, though, is not a predominantly Angel tribal list. There are only 6 Angels in the deck that this would even affect, one of which we'll actually be cutting later. And if you're building on a budget, note that 2 of those Angels are over $25. This means that as a source of mana advantage, there's just not enough here for the Aspirant to be as consistent of a reward for us as a regular mana source would be. Even if this card makes our commander cheaper to cast, that is not reason enough alone. Not when the rest of the deck needs sprucing up and all of our 4 or 5 or 6 mana cards and enchantments need help being cast too. I feel like we already need to take a brief hiatus to actually look at what some of the other angelic cards in this list are doing, though, to explain why the Aspirant is one to go, but some other angel cards will stay. There aren't many of them, but they do have different utility that prevents them from feeling too restrictive. Valkyrie Harbinger, for example, is a life gain payoff that just happens to be an angel, but it's just good life gain synergy. Most of our angels actually happen to be like that. Another angel-specific card that might raise eyebrows here is Righteous Valkyrie, which rewards us playing angels. But that's not even really what we wanted for. That's gravy. We're interested in the Anthem Pump if we have bonus life. Given that the usefulness here is still generally applicable and not just restrained by angel type, this is why some of these other angel cards are going to stick around. However, there is another angel card here to critique, although this one isn't a creature. Rampage of the Valkyries. This one doesn't need to go into Angel Tribal exclusively. The angel it makes and the angel in our command zone are decent enough to make it trigger the sacrifice effect. They're not overwhelming sources of removal, though. A lot of our enemies are likely to have random tokens that they won't mind losing to this type of effect, especially when we won't trigger it multiple times a turn, like other decks that use Grave Pact and such tend to do. So that's another Angel Tribal-ish card that we can toss out to make room for some other essentials in this list. So moving on, let's get more lands in here. Life gain decks have a ton of payoffs for gaining life, even if you only gain in tiny amounts, but every little bit adds up, so I am including some lands with incidental life gain that I'm surprised not to see in the deck already. Kabira Crossroads, Radiant Fountain, and yes, Seraph Sanctuary. They're not huge, but it can be a surprise source of life gain that gets all sorts of payoffs for us, from triggering effects like Cliffhaven Vampire and Marauding Blight Priest additional times that turn, or even being the final piece to set off a freshly cast Sanguine Bond combo. We're not quite finished yet, though. I'll swap a few less interesting lands for two more. Glimmerpost is another in this ilk, and I also think that Path of Ancestry rocks here too. Even if it's only triggering on Liesa, she's a commander we'll end up casting a lot, given how much she annoys everyone and how much they'll want to remove her. So a little extra scry from this dual land can be some nice extra value. We've made room for lands, so that's good, but there are other improvements that still need making. I spot, for instance, that one pair of shoes is here, but not the other. Remember how I said Liesa is gonna draw some negative attention? Yeah, let's get her some extra boots. There are two removal spells I spot here too, which I just think I have like a long-standing rivalry with or something. Utter End is a lot of mana to remove a single card. 4 mana is Wrath territory. And speaking of Wraths, Kaya's Wrath is a lot harder to cast than it looks. This is seriously a heavy pip requirement, and the life gain it gives us is barely anything at all. Like, if we're getting lots of life from casting this, we've done something wrong. I like having an extra Wrath in this slot though, so I'm gonna recommend exchanging Kaya's Wrath for Cleansing Nova, a budget Wrath whose versatility I really enjoy. Now, I went over the land situation earlier, but the lands aren't the only problem when it comes to this deck's mana production. I don't see a lot of mana acceleration here. There are 5 mana rocks and then like a Smothering Tithe and a Cryptghast and just not a whole lot else going on here. And on that subject, oh boy, this is going to be awkward. I don't know that I like Cryptghast here. Okay, that's overstepping. I don't dislike it. I'm just divided. There are only 9 swamps in this list. That's very little. The Ghast might literally have no swamps to double up. Now, there is an Urborg in the list, so that's certainly a point in its favor, but I'm not confident, though, that we'll be able to make that magic happen consistently enough to reap the big reward here. I think it's a fair argument to pose that there could be other players who play Urborgs too. It is a popular land, so you could incidentally get some benefit there. I'm totally down with that argument, honestly. And yes, Cryptghast has an ability that also can gain us life, too. None of these things escape my notice. But, speaking from personal experience, my entire family plays Magic. Brothers, mom, everyone. And my stepdad has been playing Black-White Life Gain for over a decade. And this is a card he has specifically brought up as giving him a lot of trouble because it runs the risk of being inconsistent. Mana acceleration effects that come down on turn 4 are already kind of a hard sell, because we usually need our acceleration to be what gets us to things like 4 mana. So for this to be inconsistent on top of that is a little bit sketchy. Ultimately, what pushed me over the edge here is that this card is growing up to be like $15 in some places, so not everyone even has this, and I don't think you need to go out of your way to get one if you're building this deck. It is a powerhouse in mono black, believe me, but in 2-color, it has a lot of hidden costs in addition to a large monetary one. If you've got one of these though, I definitely encourage you to test it and to prove me wrong. And also, I guess there is another factor here. There is another card that I really think this deck ought to be playing a bit more, which is a teeny tiny bit on the spendier Aura-ish side, and I would like to encourage players to prioritize that card instead of the Cryptcast in terms of cost. I'll get to that one in a moment though, because right now we actually need to resolve this whole mana acceleration situation. What I'm going to do is just make room for other lower to the ground mana rocks that I think we need to help make sure that we can get even to places like 4 mana in the first place. Pristine Talisman is a little basic, but the bonus life gain source, it adds up. A lot of the other 2 mana or less rocks out there these days are also pretty spendy to try and add in here, so I'm instead just going to go with an Everflowing Chalice here. It's cheap, but it's customizable, which can be really handy. I know this has already been a lot for just Section 1, but we've only got a few other changes to go. Eradicator Valkyrie, I'm not going to make a huge fuss about. This seems like another Angel Tribal holdover, but it just doesn't have a place here. It has lifelink, but so do tons of other creatures we could be playing instead. That boast ability isn't something that our deck is going to boast about. Bye-bye. Finally, the card I mentioned earlier that I think this deck really needs is Rock's Faithmender. It's not an exorbitantly expensive card, but when it came down to this or the Cryptcast, for me, this was the winner. Doubling life gain and with a creature that can defend for us is a big deal. Liesa makes life a dwindling resource, and an ability like this keeps us way ahead on that game. I really wanted us to make room for the Faithmender to make sure that we can stay afloat, so that we feel even more the impact of our other great effects that will assist with punishing our enemies. In fact, speaking of which, that does it for Section 1. These were the swaps I think the deck should make in its current state, and you'll find this list in the description below. But the thing is, we're not done yet. Not even close. Because I don't think Liesa players are leaving this deck like this. Let's discuss that more in Section 2. I have a theory that this average list we're seeing isn't just a gentle mix of a lot of life gain decks and a lot of Angel Tribal decks, but is also a mix of a lot of high budget decks and a lot of low budget decks. This is actually one of the things that made this particular video so tricky to do. 1 and 10 will average out to a 5, but that 5 doesn't tell the full story of the 1 or of the 10. Life gain is a really well-established archetype, with a lot more going on within the life gain umbrella than just what we've seen in the average deck list here. But since it is such a famous archetype, that means that over the years, its cards have had the chance to climb from a random $3 to $30. So before we discuss ways to make this deck more accessible, let's use this section to hone in on some of the ways that we might theoretically spruce up this deck within that archetype if we were to take it further. Remember that we're not adding any cards officially in this section. Instead, I'm going to highlight specific cards that a more tuned life gain Liesa deck will probably find itself reaching for, and suggest some cuts from this list that I think it could make to get those cards added in. For instance, we're missing some classic life gain cards here. Ajani, for example, is a bomb in life gain decks. Just an epic ability. Liesa plays with life totals and doesn't always just go up, 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 but she's still staying pretty high, and this one is worth staying high on life for. If the current deck has stuff like an Angel of Destiny in it, there's no reason not to also reach for things like this. And the same goes for, of course, Felidar Sovereign. Another classic, but it doesn't show up in the average list. So if you're looking to get these cards in here, these are going to be my recommended swaps. One of them can swap in for the card Court of Ambition. Monarch cards are fun, but I just worry about our ability to keep it, especially if our commander is already drawing people's attention. To be clear, Punisher effects are actually really great in Liesa. In fact, I think it's one of the amazing things that makes her more unique than some other life gain commanders out there. But there are other punishing effects in the deck that I just feel happen to clamp down on our enemies a bit harder than the court does. For the other ad, if we're tuning things up, I do start to get a little bit wary about the card Cosmos Elixir. I think this might be more of a mono-white card than it is a black-white card, if that makes any sense. The jury is still out, maybe, but when it comes to tune-ups, my love for the Elixir dwindles just a little bit. Another classic life gain card is Auriok Champion. This thing is ludicrously expensive right now, but not too long ago I recall it being like $3 or something like that. Life gain cards fluctuate in price with even the vaguest of reprintings. This is another Soul Sister effect that is just really juicy to get your hands on. So if you have one and you're looking to add it in, the next card I think ends up going might actually be Revenge of Ravens. It's a nice deterrent from people attacking us, especially considering the multiple potential life gain triggers, but once we're getting to this level of tunedness, I think we need a little bit more assurance from our combat deterring cards. The other ones we're playing require heftier taxes that more consistently disrupt enemy combat, whereas this one is still possible for a determined enemy to work through. In terms of punishment, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the card Aura of Silence, which, fun fact, I think this is probably my mom's favorite card ever. She uses it a lot. It is exceptionally cruel, and that fits in really nicely with Liesa's mission of keeping enemies hard up on casting things nicely. My recommended swap? Just a simple D-Spark. There's another life doubling card that I really enjoy too, and that's Alhammaret's Archive. Lord, this one got spendy, but players who were around when Origins was released might actually have one, and it's worth running here. These are both things that we are happy to double up on. I think the reason it doesn't show up is because of how spendy it's gotten in the years since. If you're curious where to make room for it though, my suggestion is going to be replace it for the Mangara. I know, it seems weird, but honestly Mangara is another one of those cards that I found just a smidge inconsistent. It's not a punishing enough deck yet though, is it? Plenty of Liesa players will lean way more into the punishing aspect of this commander to couple her life draining ability with many other life draining effects. The best ones are the ones that also happen to bolster our own life total. Stuff like Blood Chief Ascension, for example. All an opponent has to do is cast a spell and Liesa will make sure that this gets counters. It draws a lot of attention, but Liesa was already doing that for us anyway. When considering swaps, I gotta be honest, Righteous Valkyrie is the card that I don't think makes the cut here. It's a neat one, but the payoff from the Ascension is just so much more potent once we open that door. Before I forget, I'd also like to recommend if you're splurging on this deck that you take a look at some other bonus lands. Though I think it would be an absolute flavor win if you added in an Oh Hi market, that's not gonna be my official suggestion. No, here I think we would enjoy a simple Bonder's Enclave. It's not huge, but I like that this is another random source of draw that we can use if our commander is in play. It's a small bonus thing, but it's worth mentioning, especially since this deck doesn't want to go too crazy with paying life to draw cards, since it's already making everyone pay life to do everything else. Finally, this is purely a bonus suggestion because this card is mondo expensive, but man, if you've got it, it does belong here. Y'all know the card Hatred? Liesa loves her some Hatred. However much life we pay, she'll lifelink it back to us. No big deal. This is an outlandishly expensive card though, that not everyone may have, so I won't linger on it here. Who even cares what you would cut for it? Mortify, I don't know. This is a bonkers card for any commander with lifelink though, so I just had to shout it out. Alright, we made some fun theoretical tune-ups if budget wasn't a point of concern, but the reality is that budget is a point of concern. So let's reset and move to a more practical topic. Let's make this deck more accessible. But as it turns out, there's also something sneaky cool waiting to happen here in part 3. We've discussed this on a way old episode of the EDHREC podcast, but Liesa gets to play around with some of these same concepts. There are some commanders for whom, when the budget changes, that also has a subtle but important effect on how their strategical direction might change as well. It's episode 102. If you haven't seen it yet, definitely check it out. The data is fascinating. And it's cool to see that Liesa might be another case where some of those principles may apply. When going lighter on the budget, that might subtly affect the things that we'll want our deck to do. Cards are never good in a vacuum. They're only good in the context of other cards. So as we cut expensive cards, some of the lower budget things in this deck might be open to supporting a new type of strategy. That is what we're gonna see if we can harness here. First things first, let's actually get to the chopping. I'm gonna remove the most expensive stuff we've got. Demonic Tutor, tons of creatures from Archangel to Erebos to Resplendent Angel to Serra Ascendant, Phyrexian Arena, and Smothering Tithe are also really costly, as is Exquisite Blood, and finally, Anguished Unmaking doesn't survive this either. Cutting these cards lowered the price by literal hundreds of dollars. That's really important to hold in mind. Sometimes the biggest costs in a deck are concentrated in just a few cards. So when all those are gone, what on earth do we fill the deck back up with? Answer 1 is card draw. We lost quite a lot of card advantage effects when we culled the most expensive cards. Off the bat, I'll add in a Sign in Blood, but I want to add an asterisk to this. This is an awkward spell to cast when Liesa is in play, so don't go ham on Black's usual life payment draw effects. I think we'll be okay with this one as long as we cast it carefully, like when Liesa's not around. I'm also including another here that I love because it can be a weapon. Damnable Pact is fun because it can get us back into a game if we've stalled out a bit, but I've also absolutely used it to kill off an enemy player. It's hilarious. My final draw option will avoid paying life though, and that's just a quick and dirty Siphon Mind. This is a totally different type of punishment, but it can be just as mean to hit our opponents with. Moving away from card advantage, there are some other classic life gain cards that I'd be happy to see showing up in this deck. Sunscorch Regent is a personal favorite. This thing gets huge fast, and it gains us life the whole way up. This is a fun way to proc life gain triggers and send another terrifying attacker into enemy skies. Call me crazy, but I also like Angelic Accord here. Not because of the angels specifically, but just because it's a pretty steady payoff that I think we're well suited to trigger reliably, and not even just on our own turn. This is like a way super budget of the Resplendent Archangel. As budget helpers go, I like this one. Alright, the next two I want to throw in here are among some of the nastier effects. Revival Revenge just chunks someone's life total and feeds our soul. If they thought they were doing okay on life to pay for Liesa, their calculations are now very, very incorrect. The other one I'm recommending is a little weirder, but I've seen it do work. Tainted Sigil gains his life back equal to the life lost by all players. There's some stunning stuff you can pull off with this thing. If someone attacks us for a lot, but it's not lethal, we can blank that whole combat. If we hit someone for a lot, we can rub salt in the wound. If everyone lost a bunch of life, this tracks all of it and can get us coming back out from that on top. This is a big burst of life that our other life gain triggers like Sanguine and Veto are hungry to take advantage of, and that our opponents will find extremely tricky to play around. Now, those were all nice, but they weren't quite the different strategy that I had hinted at earlier. So what am I getting on about with all of that? Well, let's get to it now. My final three additions all change gears just a bit for this deck to make Liesa a bit more of a Voltron. When we're not being suited up by all of those other expensive Exquisite Bloods and Resplendent Archangels and all that, we can have Liesa take more of a commanding commander damage role. Sunbond, Light of Promise, and Blackblade Reforged are my final suggested additions. As Liesa hits, she gains us life and can get bigger. Or in the case of the Blackblade, it's just a really big buff that grows a lot over time. These things give us a snowball potential that wasn't necessary with the more expensive cards sticking around, but that we can highlight to a great effect when the deck has been pared down and still wants to pack punch and pizzazz. Give these buffs a try and swing in with Liesa for oodles of damage. Alright, that was a saga, but I hope that this has helped you get to know our angel a little bit better, and that it doesn't leave you asking, why Liesa, why? You can find the link to both versions of the deck in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this time with Liesa, and my apologies if I've been mispronouncing this name the entire time. I just sort of assumed that it was Liesa, but it might be something else. I do know for sure though that it would be Liesa with an S, but not Liesa with a Z, because Liesa with a Z goes nuts. There are 5 of you who are going to get that reference, and I adore every one of you for it. Anyway, if there are other recommendations that you think your fellow angels ought to be playing in their decks too, make sure you sound off in the comments below, and thanks so much for watching.